Thanks very much. Thanks very much also for inviting us and inspiring this whole program. We really appreciate the opportunity. We'd like to start first actually by playing a clip of our own. But before I play our clip, I'd like to encourage everybody to help themselves to some posters and pins that we've produced that you can find at the back of the room. They're free. And we'd love to see you have them in your basement suite apartment, because I'm sure that's where you all live. Feel free to move on up close to the band. There's a whole empty row, and everyone knows that it's good to be close. So, yeah, that's right, don't spit. Okay, I'm going to now play our first pick, and then we'll begin from there. The modern era of music is defined by revolution, actual spinning. This process, both material and technical, is foundational. It's also unbiased. It'll play back anything, from kitschy pop ballads to the most obtuse new jazz. Even in the so-called digital age, revolutions, now in terms of microsecond cycles of computations, still matter. Caught up in the field of culture, however, and it's a whole other story. The music always matters. But matters to whom and for what reason? There are more turns to come, it seems. A central tension in music exists between tradition and change. This tension doesn't necessarily presuppose a singular sense of development. Musical traditions can become agents of change as much as the weight of tradition can also be an encumbrance and a burden, but also a negative inspiration. According to Simon Reynolds, for example, the punks, responding to the overstuffed rock of their time, declared 1976 to be year zero and chose to go back to basics. Here's 3 chords, now start a band. That most early punk still took the form of basic pop songs was beside the point. Punk was a form of protest music, but it was not the first time that music has been or will be caught up in politics. Music is an agent that can fold politics and culture together, but it is ambiguous too. Its political character cannot be assumed in advance. Yet, maybe precisely because of its plasticity, music as a conduit and medium for the expression of politics. Music is a conduit and a medium for the expression of politics, even revolution. As Plato too famously noted with warning in his advice to the philosopher kings in his Republic, musical innovation is full of danger to the whole state and ought to be prohibited. What Plato was warning about is some music, not all music. What that some music is, of course, is always changing, and its effects can cross different levels of scale, from a personally transformative encounter with a particular song to a socially galvanizing piece of music that inspires popular resistance. We open this evening by playing John Lennon's Revolution. This song was released in 2 ways, a more driving version on the B-side of the single Hey Jude, which we've just heard, and a slower version titled Revolution 1 on the White Album. Produced in the context of the Vietnam War and the social upheaval of 1968, these 2 forms are an articulation of the beginning of Lennon's overt politicization. The energy of the one version, however, clashed somewhat with its lyrics, which seemed to hedge their bets, afraid of the destruction that might come with revolutionary change. The other version, done with an almost corny swing feel, redoubles that hedging in its form and also adds outright lyrical confusion. But you want to talk about destruction? Don't you know that you can count me out in? In talking about music, specifically his love of Beethoven's Appassionata, V.I. Lenin had this to say: "I can't listen to music very often. It affects my nerves. I want to say sweet, silly things and pat the heads of people who, living in a filthy hell, can create such beauty. One can't pat anyone on the head nowadays. They might bite your hand off. They ought to be beaten on the head, beaten mercilessly. Although ideally, we are against doing any violence to people. What a hellishly difficult job. Between these two Lenins, there is expressed a version of the dialectical character of music that captivates us. It is bittersweet. In an essay on the New Zealand artist Darcy Lang, Dan Graham writes, "Music is not unlike religion. It is only temporary, ritualistic exorcism against the alienating effects of post-capitalist work and perhaps a fetishized glimpse into the communal pre- or post-capitalistic state of oneness with nature. But like religion, music can also be a kind of ideological illusion, contenting workers of the oppressed classes with their lot on earth, but giving a false, nostalgic memory or promising them false commercial dreams. Music expresses a truth which is not to be totally trusted. The only fixed truth is to be found through work, per se, as an almost spiritual entity."
Okay, we'll get get started with some introductions. Actually, can I use this one? Raymond Boisjoli is in Banff right now, so he made a video for us. Raymond's work engages with the representation of Aboriginality through vernacular materials, photography, and especially text-based work, combining contemporary craft, pop references, and street art with various cultural signifiers of traditional Northwest Coast imagery. Boisjoli currently has an exhibition on display at SFU Gallery up on the hill, and he has exhibited at the Vancouver Art Gallery, the CAG, Republic Gallery, Access, Catriona Jeffries, and the Power Plant. Also, Raymond participated in the Retreat, a position of Documenta 13 in Banff. So we'll play Raymond's video, and we're going to, after that, continue across the table. And Stan Douglas. Since the late 1980s, Stan has created films, photographs, and installations that re-examine particular locations or past events. His works often take their points of departure in local settings from which broader issues can be identified, making frequent use of new as well as outdated technologies. Douglas appropriates existing Hollywood genres, including murder mysteries and the Western, and borrows from classic literary works, notably Samuel Beckett, Herman Melville, and Franz Kafka, to create ready-made contextual frameworks for his complex, thoroughly researched projects. We only have to peer out the window and around the corner over there to see his large-scale photo work about a riot right here in Gastown 42 years ago. The piece is titled Abbott and Cordova, 7th August, 1971. Leaf Hall is a multimedia performance artist and musician based in Vancouver. She graduated from Emily Carr in 2005, where she focused her study on exploring the integration of animation with audio, performance, sculpture, and installation. Her video and performance works have been exhibited at the Chan Center, Vivo, Access, Western Front, Helen Pitt, and Truck Gallery. And Hall's work in performance also includes larger theatrical productions such as Paper House and the Golden Dawn Myths electronic opera. Hall was the lead vocalist in The Mutators, Glaciers, currently has a self-titled solo project, and is one half of the totally awesome electronic musical duo Myths. In fall of 2011, Myths was part of Unit Pit and T-Mass's festival Wrong Wave, Art Rock is Dead, Long Live Art Rock. Donato Mancini focuses mainly on poetry and text-based visual art. He's the author of numerous books of poetry and criticism, including You Must Work Harder to Write the Poetry of Excellence, Ligatures, Buffet World, and Fact and Value. His visual works have been exhibited at ArtSpeak, the Western Front, CSA, and recently Malasapina Printworks commissioned him to create a series of silkscreen prints for the Institution by Artists Conference. He's currently completing his PhD at the University of British Columbia. Cecily Nicholson is a poet and activist who has worked with women of Vancouver's downtown Eastside community since 2000. She's currently the administrator for Gallery Gachet and has collaborated with the Centre for Innovation and Culture and in the Arts in Canada of Thompson River University, the Audain Gallery here at SFU, with Vivo Media Arts, and she is part of No One Is Illegal Vancouver, Press Release Collectives, and the Purple Thistle Institute. Her first book of poetry, entitled Triage, was published by Talon Books in 2011. The poet Rita Wong writes on triage. Anything can happen in the space that Cecily Nicholson opens in triage. Disasters, miracles, resistance, arporilia, right before your eyes. Urgent, broken, indomitable. This book invites us to restructure our systems of perception so that we can see and acknowledge what is otherwise overlooked, devalued, deliberately forgotten. In the face of contemporary crisis, this is a poetry that is merciless in its courage and generosity, steadfast in its spaciousness and precision. This is the heart of Vancouver, beating bravely in the tent village, attesting to daily poverty, daily ingenuity, refusing to be distracted by imperial delirium. Revolutionary stuff, no? So the way this works is each presenter will discuss a song that they've chosen, and then we'll listen to the song and move on to the next, after which we'll have questions or comments. So we should get started with Raymond.
Hello, Vancouver from Banff. I'm really excited to be a part of this event. Thank you to Kathy and Brady for inviting me and letting me participate from afar. I only wish I could be there to hear the contributions of the other panel members. And I chose a song for you to hear this evening that I've been thinking about a lot, more so lately because of this sort of opportunity to speak with you about it here tonight. But it's Alcatraz by the band Redbone. It comes out of their 1970 album called Potlatch. They're a native group from Los Angeles, and it's a song that I think resonates with a lot of things that are happening, a lot of things that will happen, that I think it's a really sort of fascinating thing that, the song was released in 1970 in the context of the occupation of Alcatraz by the Indians of all tribes, this intertribal group that utilized this clause in this treaty, the Treaty of Fort Laramie between the U.S. government and the Sioux, in which it was stated that any surplus federal property that fell out of use would revert to the people from which it was acquired. So this was used to take over the island of Alcatraz for 19 months from November 1969 to June 1971. So it was a big thing, and it was something that I've thought about. Like, I've made work concerning a song by Pat and Lolly Vegas, who are members of Redbone, and there's a certain encounter between Sly Stone and the Comanche activist LaDonna Harris that happened on the Dick Cavett show, in which Sly asks LaDonna what's happening in Alcatraz. So it's something that I'm really interested in, how awareness of this event manifests in popular media, and this song registers like some very complex sentiments in terms of like colonial histories and like Indian ethnicity. Like the line, to many you've been a nightmare, to the Indian our dream come true. I'm really interested in that capacity to register some sense of collective identity, an ability that only comes out of difficult circumstances, and really sort of think that there's something really fascinating about it, in the sense that it's this really complex thing, this prison that comes to sort of be this symbol of possibility for indigenous peoples making some like deliberate move towards changing their relationship to federal government. And just the complexity that is tied to other things, like certain ideas around modern Indian art. The idea that modern Indian art was first conceived or pursued in prison camps by Indian warriors who had been captured and detained in the 19th century, who came to create these incredible drawings. It's in a genre known as ledger art. So there's a very complex sort of thing that the prison comes to be a very sort of a difficult sort of figure, that somehow there come these really sort of interesting sort of ideas about it that I think about in terms of what the writer Scott Richard Lyons in his book X Marks Native Signatures of Ascent speaks about, when he talks about the necessity of making something good from compromised circumstances. And this song by Redbone, now it's just a pop song. It's just a really sort of like ordinary thing, but could contain within it this sort of sense of a greater sort of collective belonging that could remake difficult circumstances, not only make something good within those circumstances, but something beautiful as well, that it kind of sort of gets out of the narrative of misfortune and shows a certain possibility that I think is really important and really sort of meaningful in anticipation of what might come to be. Just to think of that recent National Post article, I forget who it was about, but it talked about this report by, I forget what his name is, Douglas Bland, who wrote this report on the really sort of volatile conditions concerning Aboriginal peoples in the federal government that suggested the possibility of a violent uprising. And I think there's this idea of change, idea of some renegotiation of those relationships between the Canadian government and Aboriginal peoples and Canadians more generally that is really exciting and difficult, and think that this song can come to have a greater resonance like amongst all of those things, and really think that that it shows this awareness of the difficulties facing Indigenous peoples, but also what sort of beauty is possible from difficult circumstances. And I really hope that you enjoy it and hopefully seek out more Redbone. There are a number of other songs by them that I really could have chosen and felt just as strongly about. So yeah, thank you again for letting me participate. Have a nice night. Bye.
Do it backwards, music first?
Music first.
Play a piece of antique dance music from 1983?
So sit down, everybody.
Yeah.
Distinguished guests, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, friends and enemies. Malcolm X.
No sellout.
Malcolm X.
No sellout.
Malcolm X.
No sellout.
Malcolm X.
No sellout.
White, black, brown, red, yellow. Doesn't make any difference what color you are. The only thing powerful is power. They take one little word out of what you say, ignore all the rest, and then begin to magnify it all over the world to make you look like what you actually are.
Much of what I say might sound like it's stirring up trouble, but it's the truth. 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 We don't care who likes it or not, as long as we know it's the truth. No, we need either this or that. This or that. If you're wrong, you're wrong, and if you're right, you're right. There'll be no skullduggery, no flim-flam. No compromise, no sellout, no control show.
Malcolm X,
No sellout,
Malcolm X,
no sellout,
Malcolm X,
no sellout,
Malcolm X,
no sellout. You can't deny that. You may not like my saying it, but you can't deny it. If you're afraid to tell the truth, why you don't even deserve freedom.
You can't say that you're not going to have an explosion and you leave the condition. And as long as those ingredients, explosive ingredients remain, then you're going to have the potential for explosion on your hands.
So I had no idea what I would talk about tonight and what song I would play tonight until exactly 24 hours ago. But last night I had an epiphany, which may or may not make any sense, so bear with me, and please forgive me if I totally make a mess of this. Anyway, the question that was bothering me about like what to choose is like the question: can music be representational? Can music be revolutionary in the sense that it could make something happen? Can it represent something properly? Can it incite something? That's kind of a fundamental question. Or is music more of a token from an era, a part of a condition, as opposed to the cause of that condition? So that's the question I was sort of toying with. I was considering this. But this song, I thought, was not revolutionary for what it says or what it represents, but revolutionary for what it was, how it said it. And it's not revolutionary in itself. It's more a part of a continuum that was revolutionary in this particular moment. This is a song from 1983 by a guy named Keith LeBlanc, who was part of the Sugar Hill Records house band, who along with Doug Wimbush and Skip McDonald did the uncredited work on The Message and White Lines by Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. Later on, they formed bands called Fats Comet, Tackhead, and Little Axe, all associated with On You Records and produced by Edwin Sherwood. Anyway, he was very much in that early hip-hop scene and involved with doing sampling, using sample music. And the curious thing about this record, I think, is the way in which it is really an act of ventriloquy. It's not. There's certain musical things that are in Malcolm X's diction, in his oratory, but he obviously did not make those speeches to be recorded in a dance track. Keith LeBlanc is somehow taking existing recordings of Malcolm X's speeches, and as a ventriloquist, making him say what he wants Malcolm X to say. So in a way, it becomes a collaboration, but in a way, an odd kind of necrophiliac collaboration, because, of course, Malcolm X died in 1965, and it's questionable as to whether or not his revolutionary proposals in that period of black nationalism were exactly relevant in 1983. Conditions may have stayed the same, but were his solutions in 1965 applicable to that moment in the 1980s, especially when the status quo had certain answers to the questions posed by Malcolm X in 1965. But the continuum I see this being a part of it is one that has a much longer history, and one that can be outlined quite nicely by Jacques Attali in his from 1977 book called Noise, The Political Economy of Music. Jacques Attali outlines 4 eras of Western culture that are distinguished by 3 revolutions. The first era ends around 1500, and this is what he calls sacrificing. The eras are called sacrificing, representing, repeating, and composing, and different ways in which people are engaging with music. His thesis, in a way, was that music, far from being a superstructural effect of the political economy, actually has a direct effect on the political economy, and that social formations in the Western world were foreshadowed by formations in music. In effect, musicians tried out a new way of organized society in music by understanding the way in which people inhabit time together through a piece of music that will be the experience of that experience in society as a whole later on. So anyway, the first era he discusses, that of sacrificing, refers to the kind of folk music that's made and transmitted by tradition, orally, folk songs, etc., national melodies, something which are passed on orally and are in a way of enforcing tradition from one generation to the next. Nothing changes in this culture. Things stay the same. It is one of sort of magical time. There's no real historical transformation. Things don't happen. Everything is sort of enforced by the aristocracy or a religious regime that's sort of maintaining society. This was broken by the appearance of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment in what he calls representing. And in this case, music was something which is not tied to an individual speech, individual culture and tradition, but can be distributed by being notated. In this case, music becomes transportable. It also becomes a commodity, and then something can be played by people who are now sort of expert players and performers who play in concert halls where everyone is silent, as opposed to being outside or in noise. And in a way, the music of sacrificing was all about distinguishing human culture, human sounds, from the sort of terrifying chaos of the natural world, which was always there, always had the possibility of sort of reminding you of your own mortality and the sort of indifference of nature to your human will. Anyway, so from representing this idea of so the bourgeois culture, capitalism, empire are all sort of within the musical formations that appear in that period up to 1900, 1500 to 1900. Repeating is with the introduction of mechanical reproduction. This is when you can have exact recordings of music, so it's not depending on performance anymore, but only the apparatus, the sort of industrial apparatus that's distributing these things. So it becomes what's being sort of foregrounded is less the individual relationship in the concert format, but instead the commodity relationship or distribution of industry in its sort of huge apparatus form between people. The final phase that he talks about is perhaps overly optimistic, which he called composing, inspired by what he saw in free jazz from the 1960s and 70s, where small groups of people would play music together for each other and not for distribution, not for to become a commodity, but for their own pleasure. But he mentions a kind of music where musicians play, they make the music for themselves, by themselves, and together in a form of collaboration. And composing is something which is not really tied to, say, notation, but something that's tied somehow to the instruments that we used to make that thing. So my little epiphany last night was that, in a way, the DJ culture that appeared in the Bronx in the 1970s with DJ Kool Herc began mixing records is a part of a continuum which sort of has returned now in our culture after a certain hiatus in the 1990s. This song, Malcolm X, was sort of a high point before the higher point of It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back by Public Enemy, which used sampling in a very, very radical way, and again resurrected this idea of sort of antique black nationalism in their lyrical content. But what it was doing is using music as raw material, recorded music as raw material. Instead of music being produced by instruments or by the human body, by human voice, they take existing music, which sort of have been taken out of history, which are, by the same tokens of that history, and combine them in new ways of making meaning. Of course, when record companies saw this happening in the 1990s, they sort of strictly enforced copyright rules, but still this culture has appeared again and again, and many underground musicians are working exactly the same way, where there's no real sense of tradition, no sense of, say, performance craft in the old sense, but instead using this recorded material as a medium, and in a very real sense, ventriloquizing the history of recorded music. That's it. Questions?
We'll save them.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're up, Lee.
Okay. Hi. Okay, so, let's see. I'll get this adjusted. So when you guys first talked to me about this music and revolution, the first song that instantly popped into my mind was Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, because it had been something I kept hearing about and thinking about, and it sort of, well, because of the reaction of its first performance in Paris, that it caused like a riot in the theater, as I'm sure most of you know, and that to me was sort of this brilliant moment in music and the power of music to incite acts of passion, acts of violence, you know, these kind of things. And just and so I was thinking about, and the thing that was really interesting to me about it was the formal qualities of the piece that were a shift in the way that people were used to hearing music. So, I mean, it was obviously a big spectacle because it's a ballet and there was a lot of elements to it, but just thinking about the fact that people hadn't really been used to hearing sort of these dissonant tones within music, and just kind of the reaction that incited. And it was really interesting. I heard this piece on Radiolab. I don't know if you guys listen to that show ever, but they talked about all the sort of reactions that your mind has when you're sort of opening up to new forms of sound or new forms of information, and that it actually can cause like sort of violent reactions. So this was sort of the beginning of where I was thinking of about music and revolution, and sort of thinking about it more in terms of the formal elements of music, tonality and time and space. And so this was sort of where my thought process began. Maybe I'll sort of grab my notes here so I can. So I was thinking about this idea of revolution through abstraction and sort of notions of the spectacle, and De Boer's idea that, you know, that our social lives are infused with sort of this political or ideological framework that is passed on to us through spectacle. So just thinking about that kind of power within that, and sort of political action being more than just political. It's also about sort of your subconscious experience of the world. And so I'm thinking about this in terms of, well, like music obviously is sort of like a mapping of time and space and an organizing of sounds. So thinking about it in those terms and how we think about time. And time was something that especially stuck out to me because the way that we think about time and we experience the world, and how systems are regulated and constructed through time. And it's obviously to think about, to have like a set way of thinking about time in your mind, which we all inherently do because we have clocks and such, is sort of a form of control, I guess, of your mind, of the subconscious. So I was thinking about these things and how the potential for formal constructions of sound to be revolutionary through breaking in our perceptions of time and space, and our experience of tone and all these kind of things. So and beyond that as well, thinking about narrative structures. So thinking about the breaking down of narrative, because well, actually, that book that you were mentioning, the Noise book, they talk about how music can be sort of categorized into either politically sort of in line with the ideological systems that are current, or they can be against it. And then I was sort of thinking about, well, what about music that is outside of that? And what is that? How does that fit into sort of our thinking about politics? Like, where does that stand? But and can that be a political action? And I definitely believe that, you know, it can. And that if you look at like timing in pop music or like a lot of mainstream music, the time signatures, you know, is 4/4, and the narrative structure of the piece is very like in line with sort of media forms of narrative, in terms of you have, you know, the build up and the climax and the resolution and these kind of things. And so, and you have that in the narrative form as of within like a piece of music in mainstream music, which you know, is it keeps us within a certain framework of thinking. And so just thinking about even breaking the narrative form, so taking music that is abstracted, so something that's repeated for long periods of time without any sort of build-up or resolution, or just a gesture that's offered of sound, is like a new way of thinking about structures of time or the possibilities of things, and in that way creates a space of freedom. And that in itself is an inherently political act, through giving us space to think about ideas that are outside of the conventional ways of thinking about time and space and form and narrative and such things. So, and of course, John Cage's 433 came to mind because that piece obviously has its own sort of revolutionary, it was a revolutionary action in just that, like, imagine sort of never thinking about silence, or, I mean, it's not silence, we never experience silence, but just to think about stillness or not organizing sound as, and becoming aware of everyday sounds as composition is, you know, a breaking with our pattern of thinking. So these kind of things. So I'm just going to play a snippet of one song by, and then I'm going to play another, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more, and then play my actual song. This first one is Chris Carsano, who's a solo drummer. He's American. Last I heard he was in Chicago, but he travels around a lot. And one of the things I find really beautiful about his drumming is it's definitely a break in narrative form, and he intuitively feels out rhythms and sounds, and yeah, and it's just beautiful, and I just really wanted to share it with you, so I'm just going to have you play a little bit of that. whole piece. Okay. So obviously incredible, but obviously. So obviously he's playing with tempo a lot and just sort of intuitively feeling out different rhythms. But so thinking about these different forms of time and how we can think about them, and repetition and sort of these, the intensity of the sort of the force of like fast tempos and these kind of things. Also thinking about the potential of that to take us into sort of other states of consciousness, as well as other ways of thinking about time and structures and such things, but thinking about it in terms of ritual and sort of our connection with something deeper or more spiritual, which is void in a lot of mainstream music, I must say. Like I always like imagining hearing things like that in the grocery store and just thinking about how it would alter how you shop, and like what an amazing political form of action that would be, just to play that.
Free jazz.
Let's see, what else did I want to... I'm going to go on pretty quickly to the final piece of music, but which is a piece by Autekra. And the thing about it that I find really beautiful is that I feel for myself, I mean, it's all dealing with the sort of like ideas of abstraction. It's all about like your own interpretation of these things. But for my own feeling for this piece, the thing that's really interesting about it is that it takes set points in time and expands them into multi-dimensional spaces. And this is my experience of it anyway, is that each moment, each sound, because of the way it's constructed, becomes a kind of a shape or a space that you can inhabit. And it's a really beautiful experience of time because obviously the thinking of linear points in time, or thinking of time as a moment that passes and it's there, it's just a point. But just thinking about the concept of time and the possibility of each point in time being expanded, obviously, into like a larger scale, which of course it is. It's not just here and now. It's existing on many different planes of reality and in many different places, and people are perceiving it in different ways. So I think that the potential for music to open us up to these ways of thinking is really powerful, and is, a form of revolution. So if you don't mind playing the last piece, that would be great.
My turn? Okay. Thanks. That was wonderful. First, thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this. It was incredibly fun to actually prepare this and to do a bunch of research into a whole bunch of things that are new to me. Most things that I'm presenting are new to me and presented themselves to me in the course of just pulling material together for this. I do want to thank Wade, Steve, Roger, Trish, Jelle, Lisa, and Juan for recommending songs and for recommending things that I might read. There's not a lot of time to synthesize and put forward as much as I'd like to, but I still, rather than, how do I say it? There's not enough time to put forward as much as I'd like to, but I'll just try to present a bunch of materials on this topic of revolutionary patience. I'm not going to try to theorize it heavily. I'm just going to put forward a bunch of the materials that I found in thinking about this. So it's more like a care package than really like a theorization of revolutionary patience. I just follow the theme through a bunch of different sites, historical contexts, and I have to present the caveat that I haven't read in depth about each of these contexts, so I can't necessarily speak to each of the contexts very well in great depth yet. So if I make historical errors, I invite your corrections. But in brief, revolutionary patience, in contrast with the kind of revolutionary haste or revolutionary imminence that would be a more common situation in revolutionary poetry or song, like the immediate call to action that you often hear in revolutionary poetry or song. There's an undercurrent of another kind of temporality in relationship to the event of the revolution that is like way more distal. Like the revolution is way further off, and what the poems or songs are actually doing are kind of entreating you to have patience and to have resolve for the long struggle, right? And so, in a lot of contexts where you find revolutionary patience being represented or entreated, you find like revolutionary discourse mixed very, very overtly with theological or religious discourse. And there's a kind of very apocalyptic sense of time that you see in revolutionary work a lot, but it's especially strong often in this kind of revolutionary patience material. So revolutionary patience then is both about the long-term social struggle and the kind of apocalyptic waiting that is involved with that. But it's also, and in a sense, applicable in either completely secular or religious contexts, just the sense that social struggle involves a lot of really uninteresting, boring, tedious work, right? Social struggle isn't like fun. Social struggle is like, typing up leaflets and handing them out and making big pots of soup and cleaning rifles and stuff like that. It's not really that much fun. And it's in that related directly to that, it's also based in the sense that any revolutionary process would take a very, very long time, and possibly, and very probably perhaps, longer than the life of any individual involved in realizing a cause. So it's about working for something that you may never see. It's for working for a future that isn't even necessarily your own future. At least that's how it's represented in this material that I found. So this might be part of the reason that it braids so often with very, very overtly religious discourse, besides the other cultural reasons for that. That there's, it's the kind of dimension of faith that's involved with, revolutionary struggle and practices, and the long-term sense of trajectory and the long-term sense of strategy. And revolutionary patience also, even when the revolution is presented in song and poetry as imminent, as about to happen, it's all often represented. That imminence is itself often represented as if as having come at the end of a very, very long moment of patience. So, these calls to get up now and fight. There's often an implication that now's the time to fight because you've been waiting for so long. But then, the temporal relationship to the event, the great event or whatever, is really, really imminent and immediate. So when I started looking in other places and asking people for reading recommendations, which they gave me so generously, I found, quite a lot in the coming insurrection, and Tikkun's The Call. And revolutionary patience in those contexts often relates to an entreaty to build the skills that will be necessary, not only to overthrow the neoliberal capitalist thing-dinger, but also to sustain life afterwards. And in that sense, it's also often presented in relationship to what it means to even engage in a revolutionary process or struggle now when power is so decentered. With power decentered, you might not even be able to think of revolution as an event, as an apotheosis that will happen, but as a constant and unending process, right? There's possibly no event. There's no winter palace to storm. There's no focalization of power like that can just be knocked over. And so, of course, that completely changes the meaning of revolutionary patience if you can't look forward to just such a specific point of attack. And one example that I actually have known about for quite a while that I really, really like is in a Paul Éluard poem from 1942 called The Last Night. Paul Éluard's a surrealist, communist French poet, where he writes about this specific iteration of revolutionary patience that I'm interested in, just the patience of the poor. Éluard's sense of time in this poem is a lot like Pier Paolo Pasolini's. For Pasolini, the death is this event that transforms the meaning of all the things that preceded death. So all a person's actions are actually not just ended by death, but death itself modifies all the actions that precede it. This is how Éluard treats time in this poem, The Last Night. And so the revolution that is distal but somewhat more imminent in the poem actually transforms just the daily activities of the poor, like just getting by, this kind of like folding, this meticulous just care for the self-survival into essentially a revolutionary activity. So it's a 7-part poem. I'll just read a couple little parts from it. I can't read the whole thing, obviously. Part 5 of the 7 parts goes like this. The poor picked their bread from the gutter. Their look covered light. No longer were they afraid at night. So weak their weakness made them smile. In the depths of their shadow, they carried their body. They saw themselves only through their distress. They used only an intimate language. And I heard them speak gently, prudently, of an old hope big as a hand. I heard them calculate the multiplied dimensions of an autumn leaf, the melting of the wave on the breast of a calm sea. I heard them calculate the multiplied dimensions of the future force. And the poem ends in the seventh part, and I apologize for his sexist language, which is constantly annoying, but we throw the faggot of shadows to the fire. We break the rusted locks of injustice. Men will come who will no longer fear themselves. They are sure of all men. For the enemy with a man's face disappears. And following this, this novel that I read recently by N. Scott Momaday, a 1966 novel named Housemaid of Dawn, has this incredible passage that's unlike anything else in the novel about a specifically indigenous kind of revolutionary patience that I think compares really interestingly with this revolutionary patience in the Éluard poem. In this passage, in the Momaday novel, it's implied that capitalism and or the white world will eat themselves. And when that happens, if the revolutionaries have been patient and resilient and have remained strong, they'll be ready to take back the world that was stolen from them. The real task then is to wait in solidarity and patience, and this is a note that you don't always see but enjoy. And so this is the passage from the novel. The people of the town have little need. They do not hanker after progress and have never changed their essential way of life. Their invaders were a long time in conquering them, and now, after 4 centuries of Christianity, they still pray into Noah, to the old deities of the earth and sky, and make their living from the things that are and have always been within their reach, while in the discrimination of pride they acquire from their conquerors only the luxury of example. They have assumed the names and gestures of their enemies, but have held on to their own secret souls. And in this, there is a resistance and an overcoming, a long outwaiting. So the imagination of life before and after capital here is the central resource along with revolutionary patience. And in song, often the places where I found it most often were in Southern spirituals like Every Day Will Be Like Sunday and Members Don't Get Weary. And one of the ways that those pieces relate really interestingly to the Momaday novel is that the Momaday novel is like really deeply kind of encrypted. It's encrypted as if it's like there's supposed to be 5 or 7 completely different readers or readerships who can't even have access to each other's reading of the novel. It's really interesting. Its realism itself seems like a kind of difficult compromise with the white world in a sense. And that I find in a lot of the poetry and song that I've seen that mixes religious and revolutionary discourse. There's a kind of encryption, a kind of coding. So not to say that religious pieces aren't sincerely religious, but that when they're talking about heaven, they're not really just talking about heaven. They also have their eye on change in this world. You know, the songs say the afterlife, they're also talking about just the other life. So in a sense, heaven is also just what the world and life on earth will be like after the event or the change. So the heavens depicted also represent a transformed society on this earth. And those strands come together really interestingly for me in this 80s song by this British band, called Killing Joke. The song's called Love Like Blood. I don't know if you could show the lyrics now. So Killing Joke, who happened to play here on Thursday night, oddly enough, they're an avowedly anarchist or leftist libertarian post-punk, metal, hard pop, goth band, depending on the moment you're depending on the album, I guess. What really interests me about this song, I mean, I like the song. It's really cheesy, but it fills me with feeling. So, I might as well not resist it. But what interests me a lot about this song, partly, is that it's a song. It's a very, very radical statement of revolutionary patience, and it was a pop hit in the UK in 1985. It got to number 16 on the pop charts in about February, March. Okay, and so. You think about the context. In March, Thatcher puts down the miners' strike, and Ronald Reagan in January 1985 is re-inaugurated as the American president, and we've just elected our Brian Mulroney. So unless you're a neoliberal, 1985 is kind of a bad year for revolution. And my question then is like, is that why the song was popular, right? It was certainly timely, but did people really hear what the song was about? Defeats of those kinds provoke despair, but they possibly demand patience. And so, if people were hearing it, maybe it really was being heard that way. But at the same time, if you think about songs like "Born in the USA," that's often heard as unironically patriotic. And so I wonder if Love Like Blood, which you can see the chorus about, is just taken as a kind of vampirish love song. And it may well have been a hit entirely as a love song, because there's so many examples of songs like that, of songs somehow being taken up in exactly the opposite way that they're intended. How do I say this? So, read politically, though, the love in the song is a kind of blood bond of the revolutionary class. It's a bodily commitment. Some people have the choice to make such a bodily commitment. Others do not have the choice to make such a bodily commitment. The song is a call, whether it's ironic or not, whether the song is good or not, whether it's coherent or not, whether their politics are something I can get behind or not. It is a call to a kind of revolutionary patience and looks forward to the day, and it looks forward to the time after. It uses the heaven imagery in the later part of the song, the dream of promised lands and fields. And it was also a goth nightclub dance hit. I just want to play a bit of that song so you can hear what it's like. And it makes a very interesting contrast with the song that I'm going to play all of at the end of this, my portion of this talk. So the heaven imagery, as you can see, is later in the song. But there's also a kind of messianism in the song, right? I heard it for a long time. I didn't before I looked up the lyrics. As when the feelings come and the act is done, which would not be messianic. But when the fearless come and the act is done, it actually turns it into a messianic sentiment, and it makes it again. It braids it with this kind of a religious discourse in an interesting way. Okay, and now to finish off, a few more things. The song that I want to play in its fullness is Max Roach's 1968 arrangement of the song "Members Don't Get Weary." I was just led to this through the research that I was doing for this talk tonight. But the only person that I found who uses the term revolutionary patience as such is Cornel West in his essay "Subversive Joy and Revolutionary Patience in Black Christianity." The waiting and patience that West hears in Black Christian culture, to me, sounds to me very much like a mix of the joy and the agony that I hear in the passage that I quoted from the Momaday novel. I'll just read a little bit from that essay of Cornel West's. The radically comic character of African-American life, the pervasive sense of play, laughter, and ingenious humor of blacks flows primarily from the profound Afro-American Christian preoccupation with the tragedy in the struggle for freedom and the freedom in a tragic predicament. This comic release is the black grown made gay. Yet this release is neither escapist nor quietistic. Rather, it is engaged gaiety, subversive joy, and revolutionary patience, which works for and looks to the kingdom to come. It is utopian in that it breeds a defiant dissatisfaction with the present and encourages action. It is tragic in that it tempers exorbitant expectations. This perspective precludes political disillusionment and its product, misanthropic nihilism. So, do you mind putting up the lyrics of... So I also looked up different versions of the song, and there's really, really Christian versions of it that use the term Christian work, that use images of Jesus on the cross and such, and they go by slightly different titles and rewritings of this. The one with the strongest and clearest socialist edge, as far as I can see, is actually this Max Roach version, and the difference might be the kind of difference that Huey Newton actually talks about in Revolutionary Suicide, the difference between a kind of religious patience or a kind of spiritual resignation and a kind of an active kind of revolutionary patience, a socialist hope. But like in the Éluard poem, you have the sense of both the patience and of the event approaching after a long, long, meticulous revolutionary patience. Roach's version is the closest to the 19th century version, the earliest version that I've been able to find. And he makes some really interesting changes that I think are changes towards are communistic changes, just by changing the pronouns. Because all the other versions of the song that I found, it's I and my. He changes it to we and our. And to me, I don't know, just the kind of person I am, I read that completely as a communistic turn from the personal to the communal, and it's a profound difference as far as I'm concerned. Okay, and now we'll listen to the song. So Roach is a drummer, composer, he's on the drums, and Andy Bay is singing. The MP3 is not as loud as the Killing Joke MP3, so you'll probably want to turn it up.
Members don't get weary. Members don't get weary. Members don't get weary. All the work Members don't get weary. Members don't get weary. For the West Coast, oh, the West most
Audience, don't get weary. That was a really great set of presentations, and that was really helpful for thinking this through, which I think at the end of the day I was actually unable to do. I don't think it's a natural condition for me to be abstract or objective around the topic of revolution, frankly. And I think that probably situates me somewhere with that revolutionary patience, and also somebody typing leaflets and making soup, so there's probably something to that. But I did want to begin by acknowledging that we meet in unceded Coast Salish territory, and I want to acknowledge that we meet in the Woodwards building on the topic of revolution. So we meet in the Woodwards building, which has had huge implications for the direct and negative implications in terms of the gentrification of the downtown Eastside community. And we're at an event funded by Van City. Van City has made public and very clear indication of their willingness to limit the capacity of a group like the Carnegie Community Action Project to do advocacy, education, and protest work on behalf and as a part of community. And so the topic of revolution in music is a challenging one for me to approach, and I think and at the end of the day, no matter what I say and do in these spaces, I think it's just consistently absorbed into that institutional order, and even worse, possibly just becomes a part of my cultural capital, so it's uncomfortable. And I would say I'd like to thank again folks for organizing and for the invitation, knowing full well that this is the context that I come from. On the topic of literature and music, quote, "If I was to locate each on a dialectical path, I would put literature on the upstep of the arc, where experience moves through thinking and feeling into action. Music, I think, would fall earlier, somewhere in the interpretive moment where we contact the earth through experience," end quote. That's a quote from my friend Ivan Drury. So thinking through the dubstep of the arch, it's not surprising that at the end of the day, I find myself looking to poetry for influence or inspiration, and thinking through the idea of revolution, it seems somehow more accessible to me. And thinking through that relationship of experience to land and place, which is where music finds meaning to me. So again, I apologize, I guess, for my intensely subjective experience. I don't really know how to separate that out and have this sort of abstract conversation. My last of my qualifiers. So I landed on the work of Linton Kwesi Johnson as a phenomenal poet, but a poet who's also in constant collaboration with musicians. And in fact, much of his life's work is characterized by these incredible compositions. He's a lifelong collaboration with Dennis Bovell and all sorts of musicians. But his work initially and back in the day was incredible also for its capacity to define and shift genres, and to be a precursor for sort of a modern movements in terms of MC, the DJ culture, rap music as a whole. Rap music, of course, for some people is still a misnomer. And as a musician and as a poet and a collaborator, he was someone that was constantly influenced by social conditions, but not just as an abstract thing, but something that he was situated in as part of his life and part of his communities, and how he lost some of his family. He was influenced by the anti-colonial struggles in Africa, by the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement during the 70s, and of course growing up under the conditions of in South London. It gained most notoriety in the 1980s in opposition, or vocal and regular opposition, to Margaret Thatcher's reign, government. And one of his most famous, or most notorious, I guess, songs and pieces, which I wasn't able to find a musical interpretation of, is England is a Bitch, and there's no escaping it. 1980. So yeah, his capacity to enter into poetics and music, graphic violence and racial prejudice and police brutality and all these kind of horrible stuff that's really hard to have a part of your everyday, and somehow to turn that into rhythm, into music, and as a part of communities that's shared, to me is something about revolution. And his use of unstandardized English consistently and still, particularly a Jamaican patois, a pidgin language that he used in opposition to the state and to the colonial, and did that, and also with a deep and historical relation to where he comes from. Yeah, so thinking through that form itself, I guess, became accessible. This topic became accessible, like thinking not about what is appropriate for me to say in this time or place, because like I said, I don't feel like it really matters. But to think through something maybe bigger than all of that, and this idea of form. And so again, I appreciate how that was taken up in the context of this panel. What else? Actually, well, the other thing that I was challenged by initially, my impulse was to bring in sort of what's on my iPhone, on me every day, and lately there is a lot of hip hop there, which I think in sort of radical left we tend to venerate in ways that are extremely problematic. A lot of revolutionary music, as we understand it and as we work through it, is produced apparently by men. But yeah, on my list is folks like Lupe Fiasco and Roots Maneuver and Tribe Called Red, and folks who absolutely come from these histories or these trajectories in terms of sampling, in terms of multiple forms of technology that are shifting and moving around the meaning of these songs. And I actually was thinking about this piece by Space Ape and Code 9 called Backwards, which I didn't know, and I actually knew this song before I knew anything about Kwesi Johnson. Samples a line of his, 1 step forward, 2 steps back, 1 step forward, 2 steps back, and it has that same plodding dub rhythm that you hear in Johnson's work. He was talking about the condition of black folks. But yeah, I thought it was interesting the ways in which, in the present moment, so many of us come to some of these old histories and trajectories, and through the 70s, especially in the 60s, of black music. Sorry, I kind of just slipped into talking about black music, but we know the samples, we don't know the originals. So it's been interesting for me, a bit of a project in recent years I've been pursuing and trying to track down and learn the originals. I was on a Bill Withers kick recently, so I don't know if you listened to any early 70s, mid-70s music. It's full on in a lot of the 90s music that perhaps influenced me more in retrospect sometimes. But anyway, so the song I chose, De Great Insurrection, the album book, Making History in 1985, incidentally. And so yeah, I don't have a digital file from it. It's not on my MP3 player. I just went trolling through the YouTubes, and I don't know, those of you who might spend too much time looking through YouTube, I'm definitely one of those people, and I find it fascinating what can find its way into this public eye and what we consume without money exchanging hands, unless of course you have to have access to the internet. And I find that fascinating, and what can get taken up. And so again, thinking through what might possibly be a relationship between revolution and music, I think something to do with about our capacity to relate to it without money. And so strolling through YouTube, and there's lots of different variations of this song. The Great Insurrection has been taken up in DJ work and some interpretive pieces, so I just chose one. And I can't say that I like it a lot. I just thought it was a good example. So it's DJ Hiatus. And it was released in spring of 2011, which is the 30th anniversary of the Brixton riots in South London in 1981, which is what the song is about. And I think, again, what might characterize revolutionary ideas or meaning relative to music, and I think it's probably got something to do with resilience. And I think further of the cyclical nature of our oppressions and the cyclical nature of our resistance and how we have to parallel ourselves through time and through generations. So I thought this song was a nice example, again, of something that sort of picked up from this particular moment of time, and somebody else has picked it up and returned and reinterpreted it. So just the last couple words about Kwesi Johnson. I mean, he cites some of his influences, again, all men, but all men that I'm down with, so Aimé Césaire, Leopold Senghor, Pablo Neruda, the likes of Jean-Paul Sartre, Hermann Hesse, Derek Walcott, and Camus Brathwaite, one of my favorite poets. And his aesthetics, he talks about his poetics and his music being influenced by a relationship to rallies and demonstrations and cultural gatherings of a political nature. And his work is absolutely international. So again, qualities that we might think through relate revolution in music. His qualities are is known internationally, from Trenchtown to Birmingham to Brooklyn. Trenchtown to Birmingham to Brooklyn. So just before we play this song that I sort of like, but I'm just more interested in introducing you to this person and his relationship to collaboration and other musicians, and to maybe take some time to explore his work. If I was a top-notch poet, still, me nah go bow and scrape, and guan like an ape, peddling no puerile parchment of ethnicity, with ongle and vague, fleeting hint of authenticity, like a black lance Percival in reverse, or even worse, a babbling buffoon with loose im tongue. No, sir, not at all. Me got me rhythm, me got me rhyme, me got me rough bass line, me got me own sense of time. Cue music.
It was in April 1981, down in the ghetto of Brixton. Babylon them caused such a friction that it bring about a great insurrection, and it spread all over the nation. It was truly an historical occasion.
Some may suffer, some may burn, but I know that one day all of my children gonna learn. Sure as the sun shines way up in the skies, today I stand here a victim, yes. Truth is I'll never die.
When we mash up plenty police van, when we mash up the wicked one plan, when we mash up the swamp 81, they make the ruler them understand that we not take no more of them oppression. And when we check out the ghetto grapevine, every rebel just a revel in them story. Them a talk about the power and the glory. Them a talk about the burning and the looting. Them a talk about the smashing and the grabbing. Them a tell me about the vanquish and the victory. Them said the Babylon them went too far. We had was to burn 2 car. And 1 and 2 innocent get marred. But what? That's how it goes sometime in a war. In a war, 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 in a war.
Some may suffer, some may burn. I know that one day all of my children gonna learn. Sure as the sun shines way up in the skies. Today I stand here a victim, yes. Truth is I'll never die.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for your very interesting presentations. There was some really terrific stuff that was said, very thoughtful, very appropriate, and we appreciate that everyone came and joined us on this panel. We'd like to take a little bit of time now to open up the panel to the audience, as well as the panel to each other, to have some short conversation about these choices, these selections, and some of the comments that were made. We do have a microphone in the house. Am Joel here has the microphone, and I've been asked to ask people to please speak into the microphone when questions are asked, so that we can capture the questions as well as the responses.
I have one.
Oh, one from the table.
When I was thinking about this, I had a sort of perverse idea of playing Huey Lewis and the News' Hip to Be Square as a revolutionary song, because ever since I read American Psycho, somehow Huey Lewis and the News is associated in my mind with the Reagan Revolution of the 1980s. So there really was a real revolution did take place in that period, which was started by Reagan in the U.S. in the 1980s, completed by Clinton, by Thatcher in the UK, completed by Tony Blair. I forgot his name for a second. I mean, this was a very well-organized revolutionary change in the way people thought about society and what their relationship was to each other. Kind of erasing 100 years of trade unionism and 50 years of sort of altered and, I guess, left-leaning social contract in both those countries. So in that context, I mean, I got a question about this idea of revolutionary patience. I'm not sure if revolutionary patience is not counter-revolutionary.
Are you asking me if I think it is counter-revolutionary?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what you meant by revolutionary patience. I mean, is it something that's a good thing? To my mind, in that context, it seems like it's a very problematic thing.
I think it surfaces in different contexts, and I think it's actually not. It's not stable. Sometimes there's a kind of despair associated with it, like even as far as I understand, like, you know, the kind of figure Roach was in the scene that he was in. I read an essay by Emery Baraka where he's talking about this scene that he's in, and when Roach noticed his friends like seemed to be kind of getting weary of the struggle, of all the difficulties and everything, he'd actually quote that song at them, and he'd quote the Long March at them and stuff like that. So it comes up in contexts that are associated with despair as much as anything else. But it's also in other contexts, like in the Elward poem, the way that kind of ennobles like just daily activity as a kind of revolutionary activity, I think is actually important, and possibly like actually a really, really positive iteration of it. I don't think it's either just a good thing or a bad thing. It's almost just a necessary thing, because if there are victories, they don't come easily and they don't necessarily come quickly. And so without something like revolutionary patience and resilience, things might not be, they might not be accomplished at all.
I guess my question is about the sort of messianic form of that, which, with its sort of religious format, believes in one answer to the problem, as opposed to a problem which is mutating constantly and probably needs different responses at different times. I always saw it very, very disturbing in a way. Even when I hear the Internationale, it's kind of a sad song to me because there's this idea of the single solution to a myriad of problems. I mean, it's just not true, and it's a kind of false consciousness in a way.
I don't know. I don't necessarily think it's true, but there's something about the way social energies of the kinds that produce revolutions have to be organized around kind of sometimes essentialist tropes, or it seems to be something about like mass consciousness and just like organization of crowds and things like that, and these kinds of false ideas around which sometimes major social movements are organized, that if you really test the ideas, the solutions too simple or something are necessary. I don't think it's like is deconstruction a revolutionary practice, or is it a paralyzing practice? Is the kind of question that one asks. If you're constantly folding in contingency and the complexity of the problems, it's possible that even just the will to do the incredibly tedious and long-term work might not be there. As the questions of morale and psychology and things like that. Honestly, I don't know what I think or what I agree with or not in this context. It just seems, looking at history, it seems to be necessary in some way. I'm uncomfortable with religion in every context, and no less in this one. I found a whole bunch of Islamo-communist poetry, which is really interesting. Like, tropes of Islam and Islamic kinds of apocalypse mixed with communist tropes of revolution. That's like so interesting, and it would be worth, I think, incredibly interesting to look at the social context that comes out of and how that's taken up.
Can I ask a point of clarification then?
Yeah.
In contrast, thank you, Donato, but to Stan for his initial bringing up of Huey Lewis's "Hip to Be Square," which could be described as the unblack music. Are you offering that as an expression of this sort of, let's call it the revolution of the taking over of this other power block?
All I'm saying is, just in that context,
or is
in my
as
imagination,
a party anthem? It's like, why not? Let's have some fun.
Exactly. It's an affirmative song. It's affirming the status quo and to be part of that, not to challenge the way things are, but to be somehow a part of that status quo and to be successful within that and to enjoy being part of that. That's what that song affirms. So, and have you read this book, American Psycho, where this sort of psychopathic serial killer who eviscerates people, women, homeless people, is a huge fan of Huey Lewis in the News. He'll talk about the contents of his medicine cabinet, the product he uses in his hair for his skin blemishes, but then he has this rhapsodic, I forget which song, but exegesis of a Huey Lewis song. And ever since I read that, I just imagine this character who's the serial killing stockbroker in Reagan's America as being that's the soundtrack to his life. Anyway.
I just saw on the internet, this will be fun for you to look up later when you go home, Huey Lewis reenacting that scene as the serial killer, playing his own music to Weird Al, who he then murders. This is a true story. Thanks very much. Are there any other questions from the audience or the panel to each other?
I'm just wondering, sorry, because when did Huey Lewis come out as gay? It wasn't at the time that song was done. It was
Certainly
much
not.
later, right?
Yeah.
So there is some kind of irony built into the fact that he's singing this song and that it's being used as a soundtrack for this
But you can
kind
be
of thing.
a gay square Republican, it's easy enough.
Yeah.
It happens.
I have a music question, and it's about appropriation and transformation from the revolutionary to the counter-revolutionary. We see a lot of musical styles which start out very iconic and very with strong revolutionary identification, which of course change and become really either nothing or in fact emblematic of the of material culture and status quo. And I don't mean things that are the product of just our illiteracy, like the Born in the USA example, where people just it's completely non-ironic. They don't hear it. So certain forms like rock and roll, like rap, have been so heavily appropriated by traditional cultures that they've lost the immediacy of the revolutionary impact. It may still be that there are songs which have revolutionary impact, but you really have to listen to them. You don't get that instantaneous recognition of the fact that you're confronted with revolutionary music. Whereas things like folk music in the sort of Pete Seeger tradition or Stravinsky still retain sort of an instant intuitive sense of revolution about them. Given that the variables of music are things like text, tone, timbre, rhythm and periodicity, key signatures, what are the elements, do you think, if we can identify them at all, that keep certain musical forms from being misappropriated, or, to put it in a less aggressive way, what is it about certain forms that just keep them intuitively revolutionary when we hear them?
Does anybody want to tackle that one? Anybody understand?
I don't have necessarily a direct answer, but it does make me think about something that's interesting, which is that I kind of have a part-time job doing sound engineering, and so I work at karaoke a lot. And I sit back there, and everyone's drinking and having a good time, and I'm very sober and just watching the board. So I get to analyze every song that goes up. But the really interesting thing to me about it is that people will pick these songs that are really just deeply meaningful, and like some Nina Simone and Tracy Chapman, and songs that are just intense, and you hear the lyrics, you see the lyrics up there on the screen, and and it makes me want to cry, and everybody's laughing and having a good time and drinking. And I think there's something about not necessarily that I have a direct answer to what you're saying, but I think that there's something about that people get in this rhythm with mainstream music that it's you turn off your mind, it becomes a commodity, and it's that relationship to consumption that changes you from someone that's actually absorbing the information or listening or paying attention, and to sort of a mindless consumer of sound. And so the words become meaningless, the sound becomes meaningless, and I don't know where the line is drawn. There's the song Hip Hop that is Dead Prez, yeah, and that song to me is I don't know where that line comes in exactly with that song, except to me every time I hear it, it seems, although I am listening in maybe a different way, but every time I hear it, it's overwhelmingly powerful, yet it has this great beat, and it's just, it gets you every time, and it makes you want to go on the dance floor, but yet it's such a powerful and intense message, and I don't feel like that message gets lost in that sound. But I do think that a lot of times once it starts getting consumed for pleasure, that music does seem to lose something of its essence. So, I mean, I'm not really answering your question, but just sort of opening up the dialogue around it. But I do think there's something to do with sort of consumption and economy that definitely affects how we hear and the sort of openness to things that we have.
Cecily?
Sorry, I just wanted to say I think there's a lot to be thinking through the folk traditions. I think that's something that's very helpful. I think locally, people who gather in each other's kitchens and living rooms and perform music and share composition in ways that aren't commercialized is something to think about. I used to think Dead Prez hip hop was such a great tune, and then I went to see them at Fortune. And actually, they did wear our anti-gentrification T-shirts after we protested for a couple hours, and did talk to us and did a shout out to the Downtown East Side. And I really appreciated that. But that song came on. They didn't come on stage till 12:30, and then I had to run to catch a train to the suburbs, or else I wasn't going to get home. And I missed that song. And my friend Harry played it for me while I was on the train. So it was bigger than a hip hop through his cell phone on the train. So it was like something changed in the relationship to that song after that experience. And that's got something to do with consumption of it, I think, in a different level. So,
right.
Yeah, it's subjective too, but
yeah.
That pertains to like Love Like Blood becoming a pop hit. And also, like, I like the song, but it's funny. It depends when I'm listening to it, like how much I like it or feel it. When I'm actually like re-listening to these songs today, preparing for today, listening to it a few times. In contrast with the Max Roach piece, it started to sound like a freaking commercial for Best Buy or something like that. Like, it lost a lot of its power and authenticity. But I think I could still feel the song. I don't think there's very much that's possibly nothing that's inherent in the music. There's not something in the music that keeps it from getting taken up that way. Like, I've listened to incredibly saccharine versions of We Shall Overcome and stuff like that. Like, it's not in the music. It's like the whole apparatus that evolves around it and through which we listen to music, and through which we listen to music literally. I honestly, I don't know if this is like an incredibly pessimistic way of looking at it, but I kind of think almost anything could be appropriated to use it in the sense that you're using the word.
Yeah, can I just, I think I feel uncomfortable with a couple of things. One is this idea of an intuitive sense of revolution, because I'm not sure about that, because it seems like that would always come out of a social condition, which is maybe not intuitive. And the other thing is that I feel uncomfortable with drawing these kind of fine lines, and no offense, Leaf, because I know where you're coming from, but like the popular and the not popular, or the music for pleasure and not for pleasure. I mean, part of the mixed up thing that Kathy and I appreciate about music, and maybe especially pop music, is the way that it can be both things, and it's in some cases uncomfortably both things. And it's unfortunate that some of these artifacts, these texts, can be bought by capital and used to shell cars or whatever, and that may or may not take away from the music, and it may or may not ruin your experience. There's lots of audiences, lots of people who listen, lots of situations for their listening. And the same song that's like just ruined through gross overexposure and like a terrible advertisement, like lots of Motown throughout the 80s. Like, it's brutal to listen to Motown be used for everything, selling everything. And, for me personally, it was like, I couldn't listen to that music anymore for that reason. But I felt also eventually that I was wrong, and that's kind of a weird thing, because it's not the fault of the music, and that music still, I think, can be approached in new ways and can always be rediscovered. Like, we can always listen again, and I think we need to hang on to that and maybe insist on it. And I think in the case of folk music, part of what makes it maybe still compelling is its accessibility. And I think popular music that addresses a lot of people, and that maybe can also segue into, unfortunately, the circuits of, super cross-marketed promotions. That's a drag, but, I think it's incredible when something can talk to a lot of people. There's no one way to talk to them. There's no one way that they're listening. But it's awe-inspiring to me still. And maybe there's an important lesson for people who are on, this other side of the political fence to look at that and go, holy shit, you can speak to a lot of people and not necessarily resolve those differences or tensions, but to kind of, gather them up somehow. I think it's amazing. Not that all pop music is good, but there's something there that's amazing.
There's a problem.
Oh, yeah. Both want to jump in. I just want to say really quick, I totally understand drawing binaries and genres and all these kind of things is always way too simplified and can never encompass everything for sure. But just as a point of reference, I think that that specifically when I'm talking about pop culture or mainstream music, it's just thinking about things that either situate themselves, and it's like, okay, let me gather my thoughts here. Things that either are actively promoting and engaged within like an ideological system, and so being self-reflective of that and sort of being like a mirror back on oneself so that you never look past that. For example, talking about drinking or dancing in clubs or shopping or sort of really conventional forms of love and relationships that are maybe damaging to people, sort of misogynistic sort of things that can occur that kind of establish like an ideology and maintain it, and then things that subvert that or work outside of that. And so that's sort of like that's just sort of the frame of reference like that I'm using in terms of thinking about mainstream music and that kind of thing. But I do think that there's a lot of potential within mainstream music to speak to a lot of people, and if you can manage to get through some interesting message and get your music heard, then that's a really powerful medium. But I think that it's really difficult with sort of the way that that industry is run to get your voice heard when you have like really subversive message to convey.
Thanks, Leif. We've got one more question. Nicholas?
Thank you. This has just been a really great panel, actually. Completely, even with the rhyme, with the video and the photograph outside in the end, and the conversation between Donato and Stan, really thick. And I would just kind of maybe double back and add a read on it more than a question. Or should we I'll just say really quick that I think that there's something great at play, and it begins, or the idea comes from the book that Stan mentioned, Jacques Attali's Noise. And this, Stan, you kind of mentioned that in the progress of music, where we've gone from a performance being the primary object to the score being the primary object, to then, this was what Attali put forward, to the recording being the primary object in the musical scenario, that then after pop music, Attali's kind of like instincts were that we would recollect on a more like localized and sort of like a coterie milieu level for producing sounds for one another or something. And this expectation of music is something. There's this anxiety around authenticity that's at play in pop music and music in general, I think. And there's something for me that pop music is about, and the way in which it maybe the abstraction that Cecily is mentioning is kind of like built into how we receive it, and might re-enter into a kind of positional and authentic way of relating to culture in a sort of inverse way, though, than the one that Attali was thinking, because it's not really about, let's say, production end anymore. It's more, and in terms of how you're all presenting the work here, about the consumption end of music, I think now, is an important figure in how we're reading this. And if I could say that I think that maybe the most politically effective music genre of the last part of the 20th century was disco, because it brought a marginalized class into a healthier more open and perhaps even leveraged relation to the sinner. And it did that not through front-loading political message, but through something entirely else that's happening. And I think that one of the elements of that, in this time that I'm trying to put it forward and kind of cover all of this, I'm not going to spell it entirely out, is that it has to do with the dance music. And this is an aspect of hip-hop, and this back to the body, on the consumer side of things, I think is what I would want to address to Cecily in terms of where music and the abstraction gets cut out now. We're expecting that on a different end as we're theorizing it, but it's actually something has changed as we've passed through this process, and I just think it's dance music as the seat of authenticity or dance on the consumer end, and disco music as being political would maybe be a frame to kind of offset where we're trying to place it, I think, or where some of the disagreements were coming out of, I think especially in between Stan and Donato. Okay, thanks.
I was going to say something before, just a study of pop music. Because there's popular music and there's popular music. I mean, there's a sense in which popular music means music of the people, but more and more there's a sense that popular music is something you buy, not something that you make. And that's the big distinction now. There's still going to be people making popular music in their bedrooms or their bathrooms for each other that you'll never hear on the radio, and that's, in a way, real popular music. However, there's the music we hear on the radio or that's being distributed by large corporations. This is a popular music which we're being asked to purchase as commodities. And it's very different now than it was, say, 40 years ago. In the 70s, so many genres appeared. There was heavy metal, corporate rock, punk rock, disco, dub music. Numerous genres were invented in that period, but imagine after that how much has actually happened. Very, very little genres have been established. Back then, A&R guys would go to find sort of weird subcultural groups that might be sort of a possible popular breakthrough. Now they look to find groups that conform to their expectations of what a genre is. There's a great little book by a guy named Joshua Clover called 1989 that kind of riffs on this idea that Francis Fukuyama had the idea that history ended in 89 when the Berlin Wall fell and there was no longer an opposition. People couldn't imagine an opposition to the West, therefore it was the end of history. But in a real sense for him, in popular music actually did have an end of history at that point because the genre conventions of hip-hop, of hard rock, and techno that were established in that year or the year after have been exactly the same for the last, how many years is that? 25 years. And it's actually a fairly compelling argument, too. So the problem is not that the music is not being produced or not being desired of people, but what's being promoted are things which are sticking to a very, very narrow genre. But there is still other music out there.
Thanks. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everyone, for taking part. When Am invited us to do this, he sent us a video to inspire us. So we're going to end tonight with playing Nina Simone's Revolution, which was written a year after the Beatles song and was written in response to it. For Simone, there's no hesitation around talking about destruction. Her version is embedded and embodied. There's no irony. It's too great a risk because for Simone, this song and what it's about really matters.
Thanks, everybody.
Now we got a revolution, 'cause I see the face of things to come. Yeah, your constitution